We got the low odor markers. I like the odor of these things. Like, I want them to make a high odor because they smell good. I love that smell. But
Smell too much.
This is low odor. I don't know who bought that,
Good morning. Even low
but
water.
Austin, good morning. All right, so I got a question. Where'd Sarah go?
She's filling in for a babysitter.
Who?
Oh, is she not gonna be here?
Who didn't show up?
I'm not sure.
Victoria?
Whoever's doing watching the kids for exception class.
Maybe. Victoria. Did she text her? Maybe she just like.
Oh man, that's too bad. I want Sarah to be in here.
Maybe just turn on the cartoons for them.
Leave the door open.
Yeah, we'll be here.
Lost her? Me, her? Or you, her?
What you got there, Fred? You good enough to share?
Yeah, I went to the wrong class. And Jim said, well, if you're in the wrong room, you still get food. And I went, oh, that's a good person.
Who was handing out food? In the other class?
Yes.
Wow.
Martin behind.
I guess so. I had no idea that that's what Is Nathan handing out food in there? Should we all go down there and say, hey, we hear there's food?
Oh, he said they had brought multiples. So to take what I wanted. Now, if they had said that to you guys,
Right.
they'd make
We'd
me
wipe them
out.
out.
Huh?
Okay, so do you need one of those, Carlton? Here we have a couple. Everybody got one? So, hey guys, for our final class, what I want to know is, hand that to him, will you? So I have a couple of things for us to talk through, but before I do, I want to know, is there anything that we haven't covered in this class that you think would be helpful to you as you try to study and teach God's Word? Have you thought of something, oh, I really wish that they would talk about blank?
I think when I'm reading the Bible, it's sometimes still challenging for me to, I don't know if, should I everywhere I try to find it, the gospel narrative in a story. I mean, I think because back in the days when you read the Bible, I was trained pretty much throughout the preaching to apply everything to myself, okay? So, and when you're still reading the Bible, you're like, okay, should I apply it to myself? Should I not apply it to myself? Like, which way I should come from to this passage exactly?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm trying to like, okay, what is the, because I also watching YouTube guy, his YouTube Fighting for the Faith. He's conservative guy, and he is very much on the top of those guys that twist in the Bible a lot, like everything to me, everything to myself.
Yeah.
And I'm like sometimes, okay, but is there, so how I can distinguish between what I should apply to myself, or actually it was said specifically for someone else only, or it was nothing to me, nothing about me at all. The best example would be David and Goliath, okay? and it's still a lot of preachers says, what is the Goliath in your life?
Right.
Something along those lines. You're like, isn't this sometimes that you can apply this passage to?
Yeah.
But
Yeah, so
it's not-
one of the most common things that happens with teaching is that it's easy for someone who's preaching or teaching to teach something that is biblically true from a text that has nothing to do with that. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
So the question of, do you face giants in your life, struggles, difficulties that you need to weaknesses that God's calling you to trust Him through? Yes. I mean, is that true?
Yeah.
Yes, that is very true. Is that the primary point in that passage? I don't think so. And so, but it is the primary point in a lot of other passages. For example, if you take what Paul says in somewhere in 1 Corinthians, I think, when he talks about, or 2 Corinthians, when he talks about the weaknesses that he has and trusting God through those weaknesses, you know, God gave him a thorn in the flesh, trusting God. You can go there and get there as the primary point of the passage, I think. So that's super common, is to say things that are biblically true that aren't really the point of that passage. Like with the David and Goliath, you want to go to Jesus with that. Jesus is David, not me. And so that's the question. I think that's the bigger question, Ivan, is you always want to go see how Christ has reinterpreted that passage in light of His coming, and then go from there. It's not I want to be careful how I say this. There's a sense in which it's not the end of the world. When you preach something that is true, like the worst thing is to preach something that's not true. Like just categorically not true. It's not the end of the world when you preach something that's true, but not in that passage.
Okay.
He's looking at Daniel like, what's Daniel gonna say?
I mean, right?
Yeah, no, it's
I mean,
the early church.
you don't want to,
Like
but
the first 300 years of the church is a lot of right doctrine, wrong text.
yeah.
It's pretty common.
And another, like what I said in the beginning, do I have to everywhere try to find the gospel narrative? Like,
Oh yeah, that's another thing is the gospel in every passage in the Bible?
Yes.
Not explicit.
Yeah,
Yeah, it depends on what someone means by that. That's the thing.
it depends on what you mean by it. There are definitely parts of the gospel, like a part of the gospel is sin, is man's sin, right? So there are passages that only have that part. There's a lot of passages, right? In fact, that only have that part, right? So you could say yes, in a sense, the gospel, one perspective or part of the gospel is in probably every passage.
Like you can follow
Can you think-
Jesus on the road to Emmaus and show where everything points to Jesus, but then the bad thing would be to be allegorical, because you could go with the David and Goliath story and be like, he threw stones at Goliath and Jesus is the rock, and like you can do stuff like that. And it's like, well, that's not how you get to Jesus from that passage, is by allegorizing it. So it's like, how did you get to Jesus? Like, what's your work on how you got there? Rather than just like allegorizing the text to get you to Jesus.
Sometimes, like in the last 20 years, there's been a really strong emphasis on the priority of the gospel, preaching the gospel, making sure the gospel is clear. That's great. You just want to let the text dictate where you go, I think. And so do you want to get to the gospel every time? If you can. But you don't want to invent things, or, I guess.
Well, when you see Scripture as an overarching story of, it's essentially the story of
Yeah.
the gospel. It's not
Right.
going to be explicitly laid out in every single text, but it plays into the broader story.
And you can always get there.
Yeah,
Right.
if you want to, take that out, see where it fits in the whole narrative, then
Yeah.
absolutely. But no, you don't have to. Don't force an explicit gospel on a text that isn't really explicit. Show where it actually fits into the broader
And that's
story.
one of the importances of preaching and teaching through the whole Bible. Like not just picking
Bruce.
a verse here or there, but taking the books of the Bible, because in almost, I think it's probably safe to say, in every epistle, Paul or Peter or John or whoever's writing that epistle is at some point going to hit the gospel, because it's central to the Bible, and so it's going to be central to their letter. So if you're preaching through an epistle, if you're only preaching a few verses or a chapter of this epistle and then skip into another one, you may never hit the gospel. But if you take an epistle and preach through it, you can't avoid it. Does that make
So
sense?
basically, if you choose to do so, like preach for the specific theme, like humbleness, for example,
Yeah.
whatever verses you're gonna choose, you have to definitely look at them in a context of the chapter, in the context of the whole book, and those specific verses if you choose them. So
Yeah.
in order for you to interpret correctly.
Yeah, I think it's hard. I think some of the hardest, I think, especially when you begin to teach, like going through a book is safest until you get used to it. Because when if somebody says, hey, I want you to teach on humility, to take your example, then you're going to try to think of, okay, maybe I can go to Philippians chapter 2 and talk about the humility of Christ and try to apply, and that's great. But then you're going to have to do some work to see how that passage fits within that context so you can be fair with the passage. If you're preaching through a book, you've done that work for the last 20 weeks or whatever, so it naturally fits in, if that makes sense.
I was thinking on something else you asked, too. It's like the problem isn't applying the text yourself. The problem is allegorizing the text to make you the hero of the story. Like so the person who like reads Old Testament narratives and says, how does this apply to me? Well, the New Testament interprets Old Testament narrative that way as well. These things were done as an example to us, that sort of thing. The problem is like it's an allegorization of the text where I'm the hero in a Disney movie is like the way it's being read. Like this is about me and my victim. And so I got the main character wrong. It's not the application part. The application part could be perfectly fine. It's when
Yeah, that makes
you're the
sense.
hero. That's the stuff that's like, okay, it's not that wasn't in the text. It's not the point of the text.
Yeah. I'm going to say this, and this is going to, you could take this the wrong way, but that's okay. You're, like if you teach enough and preach it, you're going to miss it. You're going to look back on something you taught 5 years ago, and you're going to go, what in the world was I thinking?
It doesn't take 5 years.
Yeah, sometimes it doesn't take that. Because part of that's because, again, I've said over and over again, the natural, what Jesus called the leavening effect of the Bible, of the scripture, of the gospel, that over years, like if you think of yourself 10 years ago or 20 years ago, you're going to go, man, I really, as you've grown in the Lord, you've seen the leavening effect of the scripture in your life. Well, that's true in your teaching as well, where your perspective is going to be, and you're trying to mine the riches of the scripture and present them to an audience, right? And then 5 years later, you're going to go, man, I would do that differently. And depending on your personality, if you're a personality that tends to be dogged by guilt, then that might dog you. Like you might feel pursued by, I should never teach again. Because what did I do to those people? And that's always the case. But you also have to just know that God is in charge. And how many times have you taught and somebody came up to you afterwards and said, man, here's what I got out of this. And you're like, I didn't say that. And so what's going on there is the Holy Spirit, right? Is
Right.
working in people's hearts, and He's interpreting your buffoonery. And sometimes it is something better. And sometimes you just blew it. And so you can go, God, I blew that, and I got to, next time, make sure I do my homework better, or whatever it is, But I say that, when I say I want to say this carefully, is there's a sense in which God really works through it. Like your goal is to go to the scriptures and mine the scriptures, right? But you're also a depraved person. who can't escape your own depravity. And so you're going to make mistakes, but that doesn't mean you don't do it. That means you continue to do it. And while you're doing it, trust God and His Spirit to do what He does, because He will glorify Himself through the Word, regardless of you. Right? Right. So you still do it. Anything else before I jump in? I'm going to get to a couple of passages, a couple of sermons today that kind of cover some of these things. All right, so here's today what I tried to do is talk a lot about doing the work. Should I record this? Should I go get my microphone real fast?
Probably.
All right. Everybody talk amongst yourselves. I'll be right back.
I didn't even hear you.
I'm sneaky.
Actually, like the second person in like a week that has me up.
Daniel.
I just
They're
I
never
like
mind.
how it looks itself. I see. I read a
Was
lot
this
about it.
planned or was
but
this our
actually
conversation?
like
No.
The exegetical outline?
like the
No, he did talk and asked what we should do more. And I was like, if we did an application where that
That's
might be
really funny, because I saw that and I was like,
Oh. I can read on that.
oh, I didn't.
If I'm gonna read later.
I'll make this in.
No, it doesn't.
As long as we know the information, right?
But if I'm gonna,
tell me which of those you like better.
but if I'm gonna read,
I want you to read them all right.
Right, like, you got 10 minutes.
How much are they?
How much? 10 seconds. Yeah.
Oh, time's up. Oh, yeah.
yes. You get particularly aggressive, so I'm gonna hand just like that.
They're pink. They'll be pink. They'll try. I think it's just one giant callus.
Okay, good. Then you won't feel it.
Do you have a special iPhone? You just can do?
Huh?
Is that a special iPhone?
It's just made, it's just,
Put that into the side.
earbuds that comes with that.
Soaking in brownie.
Okay, let me pray, and then we'll jump in. God, I pray that this would be a profitable, helpful time as we jump into trying to convert our private study to the public declaration of the Word. I pray for these teachers and preachers in this room. God, our heart's desire is to take your Word, to open it up, and deliver it to your people for your glory. And sometimes we make mistakes in that process, but our goal is to glorify you and to love your people by declaring your perfect word. And so I pray that the time that we have would equip these teachers to do that, and then that you would be with each of them as they speak with boldness and confidence, your kind revelation to your people. In Jesus' name. So the goal here today in this last section is to kind of what I just said was convert what you studied in private to public teaching. So this is about outlining a sermon. So you're creating a preaching or a teaching outline, and I say it's the turning point from the teacher's study to the public declaration of God's word. An outline is simply the major points that communicate the main idea of a text. So I'm going to tell you what I do, and then you're going to do it differently, but maybe it'll still be helpful. Once I find the main idea of a text, I'm studying, I'm writing, I'm making notes, I'm making observations, I'm asking questions. But once I find, okay, this is the main point that the author is trying to communicate, then I go back to the text and say, how does he communicate that main point? How does he do it? Does he do it by examples? Does he do it by commands? Like imperatives, like do this, therefore do this, do that, do this. What is he trying to communicate? He's trying to communicate that point. How does he do it? Does he give us a couple of examples of it, or whatever it is? And that ends up being, in some way, my outline. And I'll unpack that a little bit. But that's all you're trying to do with an outline, is take what the main idea is and then convert it into points. And so, the famous Baptist one is 3 points in a poem makes a sermon. So sometimes it is 3 points in a poem. And sometimes it's 2. And sometimes It's
No, yeah.
one, but what's going to determine how many points you have? The passage, at least as much as you can see. Now, the reality is that two preachers will take the same passage and have a different number of points because they might decide to use the examples as one point that communicates, here's the 3 ways he says one thing, or 3 ways he says one thing. I know I just said the same thing twice. But you can lay it out different ways, but you're still saying the same thing, if that makes sense. Result is a successful outline will accurately reflect God's heart as communicated in the Bible and will engage the listener. So the next couple of pages are just the difference between an exegetical outline and a teaching outline. And you can read that later. What do I mean by exegetical outline? What's exegesis and what's an exegetical outline? Don't read it to me. Don't read what I'm on paper.
It's basically the outline of the passage itself, like.
Yeah, good.
Interpretation?
Yeah, it's an interpretation, or taking the passage itself. How does the writer present this information? So that's the exegetical outline. And then what's the teaching outline? It's your outline. Yeah, it's your outline. Now, will the exegetical outline and the teaching outline be the same?
Sometimes.
It might be,
right?
right,
Yeah.
it might be and it might not be. The passage I'm preaching today about Gideon has recurring themes that go through the story. And so if I'm going to say, God shows us this about Gideon, that he's a fearful person. It doesn't just have a section on Gideon's fear and then move to the next section on Gideon's idolatry or whatever. It has a point about Gideon's fear, it swings into other things, and then comes back to fear. And so the exegetical outline lays it more linearly, where when I teach it, I'm going to be hitting across the passage, if that makes sense, to show that point. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, so skip over to page 14 to the workshop. So here's my idea for today. You can say this is not helpful or it is helpful. I hope it's helpful. The workshop today is I want to take texts that and give you the main point. These are texts that I've preached. I want to give you the main point, and then I want you to look at the passage and see if you can outline it. See if you can take what that passage says and outline it. Does that make sense? Now, I know that takes some work. And so we can do them all together if you want to, and brainstorm together, or you can do them quietly. Do you have a preference? I don't know what would be most helpful.
I prefer all together.
We're going to do the first one together for sure. Okay, let's start with 1 Corinthians 9. Open up to 1 Corinthians 9. I did the outline on this one to use as an example. So, just for the sake of, I take a pad of paper, and I if the passage is shorter, I hand write the passage out on the left side of the paper and draw a line, and then I start making notes about the passage as I study it, and I use highlighters. This is a long passage, it's 27 verses. Just not going to write out 27 verses. Call me unspiritual if you want to. You can, but I printed them out in the left column, and then I start going through it. I circle repeated things. I mark them. You see all that? That's what I do. And that helps me in the study and the exegetical work to figure out what's going on. And then I keep making notes. I start scribbling out my thoughts. I start saying, oh, okay, this is what's going on. Okay, that's just my chicken scratch. Okay, in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 1 to 27, what I put as the main point, this is how I said this, is that Paul is willing to relinquish good things, or what he calls his rights, for the sake of the mission, which is the church being built or the gospel being spread. That's the main point that I have in this text. Let me grab my Bible. So, this passage is pretty, Paul in this passage talks about, the center verse, or the central verse is verse 22. If you look down at verse 22, well, back up to 21. He says, to those outside the law, I became as one outside the law, that I might win those outside the law. Verse 22, to the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. This is like this passionate building up in this text. Like as you read this text, he talks, and he says, this is the point. He doesn't say this is the point, but he seems to be building in intensity. I'm willing to do this, I'm willing to do that, I'm willing to do this. Middle of verse 22, I have become all things to all people, that purpose statement, by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I might share with them in its blessings. So there's some big verses in there. First of all, the use of the word all, what Paul's saying, I do everything, I do all for one purpose. So this is important, this is an important verse in this chapter. And so if you go here, that I think is the main point of the entire chapter. What Paul's communicating is that that's central. I do everything for the sake of the gospel. That's the mission, right? That's where I got that main point. Everything Paul does is for the mission. And so he's willing to relinquish some things, even good things he lays out in this passage, in order to get to the mission. Now, you know what's great about this passage? Is we as Americans are familiar with the idea of rights. Are we not?
Yeah.
And we as Americans are not typically excited about relinquishing rights. Correct? Correct. So in our culture, when you start talking to a culture, you talk about contextualizing and knowing the culture. When you know our culture, you're talking to a culture that Paul talks about rights. You don't have to bridge that gap. We know about rights, don't we? When you talk about we're relinquishing rights, now you know that, especially for some people in the room, depending on your kind of perspective of rights, you might be talking to people that immediately are like, you can get my guns over my dead body. Right? And that's okay. But that's the audience that you're talking to. And so even the idea of relinquishing rights, you have a barrier to cross. But Paul's point is not about guns or about freedom of speech or religion or any of the other things that are in the Bill of Rights. His point is that I will do whatever it takes to get the gospel out. That's his mission. So that's, as you read the chapter, that's the point I came to. And so then if you back up, here's what I did. And it's in your notes there. To me, it seems that in the first 12 verses, Paul talks about his rights. So back up to verse 9. Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Are you not my workmanship? Verse 3. This is my defense to those who would examine me. Do we not have the right to eat and drink? You see what he's doing? He seems to be talking about rights. Like, I have this right. Go ahead and examine me. Verse 8, do I say these things on human authority? Does not the law say the same? For it is written, he's talking about having the right to be paid. You shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. Is it for oxen that God is concerned? Does he not certainly speak for our sake? It was written for our sake. And so on and so on. Verse 11, if we have sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? If others share this rightful claim on you, do we not even more? So do you see that bookends with verse 12? He talks about rights, rightful claim in verse 12. And all the way back in verse 3, verse 4, he talks about rights. So that's where I get the idea that he's talking about my rights. All right? Let me move on. So then what all I do in those passages is just unpack those few verses. So that's kind of where I got the idea that Paul's rights is the first 12 verses. Now, when you get to the middle of verse 12, look at the word in the middle of verse 12. And if I have an ESV and it has the word nevertheless right there. Instead. So what is that conjunction right there? What does that indicate?
I also have never.
Even though that
something else. Like
It's
you
a
show that we're going to do this.
Exactly.
It's like-
Exactly. It's a conjunction of change, right? This is true, but.
Right.
So he says, nevertheless, we have not made use of this right. He's still on the subject of rights, but he's saying, I'm not using those rights. I'm not taking advantage of those rights. So we see that Paul has rights, and the second point is Paul's relinquishment of those rights. That's all I'm trying to do, is try to say what the text says. Paul's relinquishment of the rights. So he goes on through that, through verse 18. Look at 18. What then is my reward? That in my preaching I may present the gospel free of charge, so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel.
Here we go.
So he's still talking about rights. But now what is he doing? Why is he talking? What is he relating his rights to? At the end of verse 18. He's relating it to the gospel. I am not making use of my rights in the gospel. I'm trying to present it free of charge. I have the right to be paid, but I am relinquishing that right. Why?
So the gospel is
For the gospel. Because I want to make sure that what's central is central. And so he has decided to set apart that for his mission. So then, and that's why you see these rights, relinquishments of rights, and then that's why when you get to 19, it's like he starts to kind of build an intensity. Though I am free from all, I have made myself servant. What is that? That's rights, giving them up.
To me, that's the gist of the passage.
Absolutely. Because he's going for what? Keep talking.
Well, he's stating, though he has freedom and rights, he's relinquishing those rights to win as many as he can.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So that he builds this up. He says in 19, I'm free, but I've made myself a servant. 20, to the Jews, I'm a Jew. 21, to those outside the law, I'm outside the law. What is he saying? My rights are nothing. They're nothing. Why? What matters? The gospel. And that's why when you get to 21 or 22, to the weak, I became weak. So I'll be strong, I'll be weak, I'll be a Jew, I'll be a Gentile. I'll be whatever you want me to be, in a sense, for one purpose. And that's the middle of 22. I have become all things to all people. That purpose statement. That's why have I become all things to all people? A lot of people have abused this verse, by the way. I become all things to all people, that means there's absolutely no moral foundation for anything. That's not what he's saying.
Yeah.
Is he?
No, it's for the sake of the gospel.
It's for the sake of the gospel, which does have moral implications. So he says, I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I might share with them its blessing. And then, so that's the mission, right? And then what's the rest of the chapter? What is that?
But his prize is eternal.
Yeah, but what's he using? It's a what? It's an analogy, right? He switches, it's like he teaches, preaches, and then he gives you an illustration.
It's his 3 points in a poem.
It is his 3 points in a poem.
Where's the poem?
Well, and Paul's good about keeping like the application in passages. Like he does it quite throughout some of his letters. It's like, oh, this, and then this is how you apply it.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
So, in our culture or our life, where we could apply it?
What'd you say?
Could we apply it to the guns as well?
Can you apply it to guns? Don't touch my guns.
I mean, so if we're gonna have the law.
Right, so that's the question, is how do you apply it? You tell me how to apply it.
Okay,
I
it's
know
interesting
how
for me,
I-
especially about the guns. I mean, for me, I never had the gun, okay, because in Ukraine you could not have a gun, okay. Only here I start thinking about that. But again, if we eventually gonna have the law that bans the ownership of the private ownership of the guns, we as a Christians, should we fight it with the guns actually? Or we should relinquish our right that we understand we have this right and just give it away for the sake that we actually might win those people that are against the guns, and by doing this,
Right.
we might
So
give an
what's the
example.
bigger question? The bigger question is not, let's go through each of the amendments to the Bill of Rights and ask, are you willing to give those? What's the bigger question for Christians?
Can we correctly show the gospel? Or
Yeah, you're getting
But
there.
does it matter in the face of the gospel? Does it matter if you own guns or not in the face of the gospel? What is, like his point is he's gonna relinquish everything if it benefits the gospel, if it gives God glory in that. So what benefits, what do we do that will give God glory, that will show the gospel
Right,
to others?
right. Good. Anything else? How
Yeah,
else
I
would you say that?
that, you know, Paul's whole purpose here, in my mind, is to tell people, look, I'm very serious about the gospel. I have rights all over the place. I'm a Roman citizen, okay? I'm an apostle of Jesus, and I have rights. But I'm serious about the gospel. And so I am willing to give up those rights to advance the gospel.
That's right. It's keeping the right priority, I think is what the bigger picture that he's, and all of you have said it. Like it's seeing, I say it this way, am I an American first or a Christian first?
Right.
That's the question I would ask. I was in Asheville a few months ago, drove past a church, and you know, a lot of churches have American flag and Christian flag out, and I'm not a huge fan of that necessarily. But this church had a flagpole and had an American flag and Christian flag out, but the Christian flag was on top. And it's so stuck out. Like I was like, that looks so weird. And then I thought, but if you're gonna fly them both, I think what they're trying to communicate is one's more important than the other. My identity is bound to one more than the other.
Wow.
And I thought, if you're gonna fly them both, that's probably the right order for the Christian. I assume that's what they were trying to communicate. I have no idea anything about the
You
church.
might have just done it wrong.
Yeah, you might have just been stupid.
That's it. Sorry to break up there.
But for me, so that's for the audience. Okay, so you're thinking about in the South, God and country. It's not necessarily. You're not preaching a sermon to try to get people to be willing to give up the Bill of Rights, because that, first of all, I'm not sure that's what Paul's trying to communicate anyway. What he is trying to communicate, I think, is the primacy, the priority of the gospel. And so for me, there's a sense in which I'll be glad to talk about the Second Amendment. I'll be glad to talk about the First Amendment, which I think is, especially for Christians, so important. The ability to be able to speak, freedom of speech and religion. I'll be glad to talk about that with somebody, but I am not going to fight with somebody over the Second Amendment when they're lost. You know, like, we can talk about it, but is that am I going to be posting on Facebook repeatedly about how important it is that we defend our rights? That, hey, there's, Cabela's has a bucket of bullets, 5,000 rounds of 22 ammo on sale. Go stock up in case they come to take our guns. Or whatever, which is what people do. Personally, I'm just talking about me. I'm not saying that's wrong or sinful. I don't think it's sinful. I think what Paul's driving on is something that kind of takes the higher priority. Give me other thoughts on that?
But it's also like not a either or, like you have to relinquish, like you can practice your freedom of speech. But,
Yeah, no, that's a good way to say
you
it.
can temper it. Like you have the freedom of speech, you're allowed to call people idiots. But like that's your right as an American.
Depending on the context, right?
But you could just instead say, I think you're wrong, and we can agree to disagree. Like, so you can temper your Second Amendment rights. You have the right to call him an idiot, but
Right.
so you have to figure out how to navigate that.
Yeah, that's right. That's good.
I think it goes back to when Paul says all things are lawful, but not all things are beneficial. He's saying, I have all these abilities to do this and that, and I can take it easy, and I have all these rights, but it's not what's beneficial.
Oh, he never even says the rights are bad. As in, Like he's saying. No,
That's exactly right. Talk
I'm
about
not
that.
gonna take a salary for preaching the gospel, but at the same time, he's not blasting all the people.
That's exactly right.
So he's saying this is a good thing. In my case, however, it serves me, it serves others better if I don't. So he's not blasting right. So
That is an
go back
excellent
to
point.
guns. Well, he doesn't explicitly say I have to give up my rights.
Right.
He does leave it.
He
kind of
doesn't
open.
ever say you have no rights. Everyone should give up every right they have. He doesn't ever say that.
He's just saying, keep the main thing the main thing.
Exactly. All right, flip over to, let's do another. You ready? Watching my time here. Flip over to Galatians chapter 5. And if you skip down, I think maybe to the next page of your notes. Top of the next page. So, this is the first sermon that I preached in a marriage series that we did last year, earlier this year, I can't remember. But so somebody asked about when you kind of drop into a passage or you're preaching, like somebody says, preach on humility. So this one was really trying to think about when you start a marriage series, what gets to the heart of marriage. So this was purely trying to think about that. And I think I heard or read somebody, I know what it was. I read Paul Tripp referenced Galatians chapter 5, and I thought, hey, boy, the fruit of the Spirit, if we could live the fruit of the Spirit in our marriages, wouldn't that help? Right? And so I backed up to Galatians chapter 5 and started reading the fruit of the Spirit. Well, if you look at Galatians 5, look at verse 16. He starts verse 16, this is the, fruit of the Spirit. Skip down to verse 22, rather. This is the fruit of the Spirit. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, and so on. So you could start right there. But that is in the context of something else, isn't it? Like there's more to that passage going on. So then if you back up a little bit, you go, oh, right before that, verse 16 or 18, he says, if you're led by the Spirit, you're not under the law. Now the works of the flesh are evident. So he talks about the works of the flesh before he talks about the fruit of the Spirit. And then if you back up a little bit more, at verse 16, he says, but I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. Now that seems to be the introductory phrase to what comes next, right? Because it's contrasting flesh and spirit. So what I started out was with fruit of the Spirit would be great. But really, when you start studying it, what's Paul doing? Paul's contrasting the works of the flesh and the fruit of the Spirit. And then if you back up a little bit more, you really get the overarching statement, which in verse 13, he says, you're called to freedom, but do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love, serve one another. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So the through love, serve one another seems to feed into, now you can back up and talk about freedom all the way back at the beginning of chapter 5, right? That's when Paul begins to really unpack that. But he talks about persecution some and other things there. But really verse 13, I felt like started this kicking into through love, serve one another. And the fruits of the flesh or the works of the flesh is the opposite of through love, serving one another. And the fruit of the Spirit is the evidence of through love, serving one another, if you will. So that's where I got the self-centered actions begin with a self-centered heart. So the actions is the works of the flesh, the fruit of the Spirit. The heart is love your neighbor as yourself, or through love serve one another. So that precedes, like what's going on down here precedes even in what Paul says is going on there. So I don't have the outline for you in your notes. I want you to talk about it and see what you can come up with the outline. And I can give you more or less. So So if Paul is saying, here's the question. If Paul is saying that self-centered actions begin with a self-centered heart, talk to me about how you see some of that in the passage by looking at it and reading it. I realize I'm just throwing you into it, right? How do you see it in the passage? If that's, you see the main point, self-centered actions begin with a self-centered heart. Start talking to me about the heart, talk to me about actions. First of all, what does verse 13 through 15 say about the heart?
Verse 15.
13 to 15. So he says, verse 13, you were called to freedom, brothers, only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. So there's a contrast there between selfish and unselfish, right? Talk about that. What's the contrast?
How you use your freedom.
How you use your freedom, good. And which is what? How do you use your freedom? How does Paul say you use your freedom?
Serving one another through love or being selfish.
Yeah, talk about the bad one.
Fighting.
Fighting the war.
Yeah. Yeah. You use your freedom as a what?
A weapon.
As an opportunity for the flesh. Yeah. So that's what he says. And the biting and devouring one another, watch out that you're not. So what do you think he means by biting and devouring one another? It's not rocket science. He's being obvious.
Talking about each other, picking each other apart.
Yeah. Destroying one another with words and actions.
Bullies.
Cannibalism.
Yes.
Yeah, that too. Sure, that too.
Yeah.
That could be harmful.
So an opportunity for the flesh here is freedom becomes about who?
Myself.
Me. That's right. Yeah. Yeah, I think what Paul's saying is freedom in a fleshly sense is about me. And then the contrast, what's the contrast?
To love others. So.
Yeah. Freedom is the freedom to through love serve one another, right? Right? That's kind of the change there. And so he says, for the unselfish heart, he says you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And about the selfish heart, the result is that you'll cannibalize one another, to use Austin's word. It is a good one, actually. You know what's great about that word? It's shocking. Yeah, it's graphic. But that's what Paul says. He says, but bite and devour. And if you say, like, that's a great sermon point right there, is cannibalize. Because nobody wants to be a cannibal. I'm sure somebody does, but...
Yeah, simple my point at all.
Okay, so he talks about, so first of all, those first few verses are, what I call them is the condition of the heart. So, and the contrast is what again?
Flesh, spirit.
Yeah, flesh, spirit. What are other words he uses? Flesh, spirit.
Others and me.
Others and me, yeah. Selfish, unselfish. Serve or consume others. Yeah, good. Also, all those contrasts are there, and that will help you kind of unpack that to show that to people. Then he says, but I say, this is the contrast. What time is it?
10:24.
Okay, we've got a few minutes. But there's a contrasting conjunction. But I say, walk by the Spirit and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. Now, Steve, so that's where what you said about spirit and flesh, that's the contrast, I think, there. Like selfish, consuming flesh. Unselfish, serving spirit. All those things go together. You with me so far? All right, so keep keep looking at it. Now as you get into verse 16, now he says, when Paul says walk, what is he talking about? Is he talking about exercise? What's he talking about? Throughout his epistles, when Paul says, I want you to walk as wise, not unwise. I want you to walk, whatever.
How you live.
How you live, exactly. So right here, the word walk, Paul's talking about how you live. So what does he say about how you live?
Live by the Spirit.
And not by. So when he talks about how you live, what's he talking about? He's talking about actions, right? That's how you live. So I think that Paul's changing here from heart, the condition of your heart, to your actions.
But of course, your actions are going to flow from your heart.
Exactly. So then verse 17, he goes back to talk about the heart, the desires of the flesh. You will not grow if the desires of the flesh are against the Spirit, and the desires of the Spirit are against the flesh. For these are opposed to each other to keep you from doing the things you want to do. So what's the major point there? That the flesh and the Spirit, are they friends?
No.
Do they get along well?
No.
Is it okay to have both? No. He's saying they are at war. Verse 18. But if you are led by the Spirit, wait. Yep. But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law. Now the works of the flesh are evident. So what we get from that so far is he talks about the heart, now he's talking about works. And he's talking about these two, flesh and spirit works, are incompatible. Right? They're incompatible with each other. And then he's going to talk about what those, he's going to kind of flesh that out a bit, right? But the first thing you see is that the command for Christians is to what? Which one of those are we supposed to pursue?
Spirit.
I say, walk by the Spirit. Live by the Spirit. That's your command, is to live by the Spirit. And then he starts to unpack those things throughout the passage. Now, you can continue and you can unpack behaviors. You can unpack how those things, like this could be a couple of sermons. You could do a sermon on the heart and how that flows out into actions, and you can do a sermon on the actions that flow out from the heart. Does that make sense? For this one, I stopped there because my point was I wanted to get to the heart of marriage. And you can go through and you can unpack love, joy, peace. Like you could do a sermon on every one of those, could you not?
Yeah.
Like you could start with love and you could do a study on love in the Bible and there's your sermon. You could do a study on joy. That would be a great sermon. You could do a study on peace. This would be a great Christmas. Love, joy, peace. There's 3 of the great Christmas themes right there, right? You could do one each Sunday. And you could keep going. You could do an entire marriage series on the spiritual gift, on the gifts of the Spirit, right? Love, joy, peace. You could do one each. Because how much would our marriages be helpful on that? For this one, I stopped there to just try to hit how the heart fuels actions. So that's why I said self-centered actions begin with a self-centered heart. Because really, I think that's Paul's first point. If you take the whole passage as a whole, you might say, that's the first point in your sermon. The next point's going to be, here's the actions, or something like that. Does that make sense? Your main point might be something bigger. Am I getting too far in the weeds? Go ahead, Steve.
Now, why is, when the text presents actions flow out of the heart, and then the text presents a bad heart, also presents a good heart, why is the main point of the text just the bad?
Just the bad?
Why is it selfish actions flow from a selfish heart instead of
that is a
actions flow from
great
the heart?
point.
Because he talks about both. Yes, you're probably going to emphasize one, but the main point of the text would be...
You're exactly right. That's a really good point.
This can also tie into put in and put off, right? 'Cause
Do you see what Steve's saying, first of all? Do you see what Steve's saying? The main point I said is the negative side.
Right.
But his point is actually both. It's not just the negative side, right? You're right. So how would you say that then?
Just something along the lines of actions flow out of heart equals actions flow from the heart. Because he talks about
Yeah,
bad actions flow from a bad heart,
yeah,
good actions flow from a good heart.
yeah, that's exactly right.
Top good part.
Yeah,
That's spirit.
But
Make your title right there.
the thing is that he's not saying about the actually actions from the good side. He said already about the fruit of actions that he did not mention.
yes,
He didn't say about the actions, because he's saying about the bad actions, but from the good side, he's saying about the fruit, that in my understanding, fruit is already finished of the actions that he did not mention,
yeah,
actually.
yes. So do I understand you right, that you're saying the fruit of the Spirit is not necessarily action? Is that what you're saying?
In my opinion, no.
Yes. So I agree, and I disagree. All those things in the fruit of the Spirit connect to actions. They are not only actions. You're right about that. But you can say I love you, that you love Yulia. But I mean, if you never act like it, then at some point somebody's going to look at you and say, you're all talk. You don't really love her.
Yeah. When I was
No, it's not only action, though. It's not just in doing loving things.
We're against both dead faith and dead works.
Yeah, there you go.
Mhm.
See? Nice way
But
to
he
say
says
it.
that in verse 19, he says, but now the works of the flesh are this. So he's using different words, but I think he's
Works and
talking
fruit.
about the same
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah,
Was produced.
yeah.
Yeah.
I guess when I was thinking before about this passage, what was struck me that I always was thinking about the fruit of the Spirit as something that grows in me.
Yeah.
It's not necessary that it grows always only by the specific action.
Right.
But the Spirit can work in you and you are learning how to love and then you act on it.
Yes. Yes. That's true too. Yes. I think that's fair. Yeah, good.
For me, this is one of the important passages that I sometimes think in life, because it's a lot of people saying, the fruits of the Spirit. I'm like, first of all, it's not the fruits of the Spirit, the fruit of the Spirit.
Right.
You never can grow in love, not to grow in joy.
Right.
Okay, it's impossible. Grow in love and joy will be here. No, I know it can be different, but if you're growing in love, something else have to grow as well here. All that whatever he's saying, you could not be lovely but not humble at all.
Yeah, so I think also too, Ivan, to your point, is that one of the things that Paul's getting at with the fruit of the Spirit is that there are people who do not know the Lord who are loving, right? There is a common grace that's given to all of creation. Psalm says it doesn't just rain on the righteous crops, it rains on the wicked crops. There's common grace. And so people have the capacity to love because God is love, even if they deny Him. They still have that capacity. They have the capacity to live at peace, to have some level of joy. What Paul's driving at is that the true nature of those things flows from the Spirit, the Holy Spirit. And so as Christians become more and more spiritual, if you will, like filled with the Spirit, experience the activity of the Spirit in their lives, then these things here will be even more evident and more, I want to say, purely spiritual, or purely love is more purely love because God is love. Love ultimately flows from God. So the more we walk in the Spirit, as it will, the more that love becomes the true essence of what God meant it to be. Am I saying that right? Daniel, is that fair?
I spaced, sorry.
Just say yes.
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 Yes. I actually thought about it now, it's like, I don't even know what I'm saying.
So I say all that to say, yes, it is the fruit of the Spirit. Yeah, I think you got it. Okay, last thing I'll say is, so I think what you're seeing as we all even talk about a passage together, there's different perspectives as you kind of try to uncover it, and you can keep going. One of the things that might be helpful as you study the Bible is to do it with people. Sometimes it's helpful to say, to study it and then go back and say, what do you say? And that can be super helpful to get to hear somebody else's perspective. And then the last thing I'll say is, my encouragement to you would be to keep doing it. Like, keep trying to study, to mine it, to uncover it, because you'll teach it through the Spirit one way, which will be true and helpful. And then the next time you do it, you'll go, man, I think I can go a step further with that, or it's a different audience, and so I'm going to come at it from a different perspective. And that's the nature of the power of God's Word. So keep going with that. I'm sorry, I brought 6 sermons for us to go through today, or 5, and we got through 2.
I'll get 45.
Thank you guys for being part of this.